one of the greatest of all time small form factor cases, and today we're going to give it an update. Welcome to Machines and More. We've been doing M1 Evo and M2 content. In fact, I did an Ncase M2 build just last week, and I thought, why not? Let's dust off and update the M1 Classic with Ryzen 9000 and a 4000 series GPU. We'll do a similar cooling setup to our M2 build, and it's just in time for another update of a classic that I've been waiting for, AOM or Age of Mythology Retold, which is launching. You can't get this case new anymore, but it's always fun to see what you can do to refresh an older case. Many of you still have this case. In fact, the case is still perfectly good as long as you pick the right components to fit inside of it and upgrade it. So let's do the build. I'll talk through a few highlights, and then I'll discuss how it performs and why this is still an awesome setup in 2024. We're going to start with this build. This is the Ncase M1 Classic, as it is known now, since been superseded by the M2 and the M1 Evo. But this case is still very good as long as your graphics card can fit within these dimensions, and the cooling capability in terms of the air cooling is not super different compared to the M2. The M2, of course, having a little bit more clearance for something like the Noctua D12L. But the cooler we're going to be using today is the Peerless Assassin Mini 120, which we did recently in the M2 build, and will be a good complement to this case as well. One thing I really miss about this case is just the toolless panels. The M2 and M1 Evo does not have that, and this one's still very satisfying to just take those panels off and build with. I still have a fairly modern set of front I/O, the USB-A, high speed, and USB-C, and of course the HD audio, which is no longer present on either M1 Evo or M2. So this aside, let's talk about what's going inside. We'll prep the board up. For this build, we are going with, that's my favorite CPU so far from the Ryzen 9000 series, the 9700X. I think it's a very good choice for a productivity / gaming system in an SFF build. I've taken off the heatsink here on this ASUS B650E ITX board, which is one of the best boards in the current AM5 lineup for ITX. I'm just going to slot in a Team Force Gen 4 drive here. The GPU we're going to be using will have an extra drive, and there is still a rear slot on this board for future use if needed. Things I like about this board: the heat sinks are not obnoxiously tall, and all the headers are at the top for easy connection. This is not easy. A lot of board manufacturers don't do that because it's easier to lay out a board without that in mind. For the RAM kit today, big thanks to Clev for sending by their Crass V RGB. It's a DDR5. And a very high-speed kit, which I'm going to be doing some testing with as well. This is a 7200 megahertz kit, CL34. And the subtimings are pretty good on this too. This is 34, 44, 44. So 24 gigs each stick. Same exact cooler that we did the recent M2 build with. And so far this Thermalright cooler is impressing me a lot. So the board's set up. I've got the hardware on. The RAM is inserted in. So I'm running the HD audio cable underneath the M.2 heatsink, and then I'll cover that up. And then we've got the front I/O cables over here. Some other USB-A cables here. The power supply cage. Flip the case around, and that was these 3 screws over here. We've got here is the Fantex 850 SFX. Pretty good unit. I'll just attach the power supply cage to the bracket. Replace Already got the modular cables hooked up here. One thing nice about the M1 Classic is this little recess here in the front panel that you can tuck some cables away. Little cable management with this tie over here, just to cinch them up tight so it doesn't interfere with the graphics card. Okay. We're going to do a build with the 4060 Ti Asus Dual. It's the one we just reviewed, with the M.2 slot. Gen 5 drive here, the MP700 is what I tested this card with. We can run it at Gen 5 speeds. Just bifurcate the Gen 5 slot. It will slot in pretty easily. Just make sure that we can use the toolless. Okay, that'll mount up, just turn the little dial there. And we'll put the heatsink back on. This is a little bit tricky. So after you've booted up, set the slot to bifurcate, and I'll throw the BIOS setting up. With the space under the card, we could run a few slim fans. I don't think it's necessary with this card. It runs very cool as is. And the space underneath here, that's only going to allow for a little bit of an air gap, which should be fine for these larger diameter fans, but there's kind of no need. The card can run pretty cool already. And it's not a terribly power hungry card. So I would say with a card like this, we can go ahead and just skip the bottom fans. I did want to plug in the case fan cable for our side panel fan. Go ahead and just use this header over here. And I'll just route that around here because the fan's going to be on the side panel right here. Plug in our cooler fan cable. And I can go over here. Thermal paste guard to keep thermal paste from going into the grooves on the side of the IHS. A little bit of thermal paste here. Peerless Assassin 120 Mini on here. At the time, the Silver Soul 135 was the one that you would use for kind of the 120mm tower that would fit in this case. It's a very good cooler too. Make sure we plug in our AC power cable here. Very nice compact build here. Not a very large GPU. Fits in here very nicely. A side panel fan on this rad bracket. You can see this was really neat because it had two positions. This one this position hits the bumper here. We can just slide it down here. And it'll fit perfectly, no interference at all. Chromax NFA 12x25 from Noctua. That'll slot in right next to here. That's gonna help the exhausting cooler. Let's attach this side panel bracket. Just gonna make sure that there's nothing in the path of this fan. All good. So that is pretty much the build here. We've updated the M1 Classic with a Ryzen 9000 9700X, the latest AMD CPU, and then the 4000 series 4060 Ti here in here. One of the best tower air coolers that you can get for this case that'll fit in here. And I think airflow wise, we'll see some very good results with this setup. We'll just put the panels back on. AOM Retold, it's definitely a remake of a classic, and it's very enjoyable. I'm still learning it, still figuring it out. I still consider myself more of an AOE guy myself, but, you know, it's good to have options, right? So it is always a treat building in the M1, and this was my daily driver for quite a while, and while it's a little worse to the wear from the countless ways that I've rebuilt in it, this would still be a very relevant case for many, many years to come. So you'll notice I went with the Asus 4060 Ti SSD edition to get that higher speed Gen 5 drive slot. And while the Asus B650EI does have a native Gen 5 front slot, this would be a good way to expand out another Gen 5 slot, or if you happen to have a compatible board that has a Gen 5 expansion slot but only a Gen 4 drive, this would be one way to get a Gen 5 M.2 in your setup. One note on booting this exact system up: if you went ahead and installed the drive already, just make sure you boot in with the iGPU. Ryzen 7000 and 9000 has that iGPU, you might as well take advantage of it. Just boot in with that and go into BIOS and then set the slot to bifurcate for the M.2 drive. And after saving those settings, you can just boot up with the GPU as your primary graphics. The 7200 MHz 48GB Clev RAM kit booted up fine with the 9700X. I set it to Expo. Your 9000 series Ryzen CPU isn't guaranteed to boot with that highest speed, so just be aware if you're thinking of going with such a high-speed kit, because everything beyond 56 MHz is technically considered an overclock for Ryzen 9000. They do make this kit in 6000 MHz speed as well, so that I think would be a good middle ground speed choice. So definitely check their kit out, and that's the sweet spot for RAM speed and Ryzen 9000. The 9700X, like we covered earlier, it's a great CPU for an air-cooled SFF hybrid system like this, where you may need the CPU for some workstation needs, or where the applications you work in thrive on single-core performance, but at the same time you also want to game at a high level. This is it. And on the Thermalright PA120 Mini, it runs incredibly well. In fact, the 88 watts PPT it draws down is a piece of cake to cool in this case. With this load, the PA120 fans ran at around 1060 RPM, and that's barely audible, with a very, very comfortable temp for the CPU, which won't throttle until 95 degrees, so you've got plenty of headroom. You can definitely up the power limits, and I would encourage you to do that with the 9700X if you're comfortable with that. Play with the curve optimizer, lift those power limits, and that will get you a lot more performance, because this cooler is definitely up to the task. I do really like this cooler, though, for an M1 update or an M2 build, so full review is coming soon. For gaming, you'll definitely be able to play AOM Retold with all settings maxed out. I played on the Mythic graphics settings, which is the highest level, and I was getting around 115 FPS. Really fun title. Still learning it, but the UI does seem so early 2000s to me, so I'm going to have to get used to that. Temps settle in at a comfortable level. The noise is not excessive either. The GPU fans clocked in at 2340 RPM on average, which, as I mentioned during the build, you could add bottom fans here if you have them already, but if not, then it's debatable whether the additional cost can be justified. If you're noise sensitive, those will help the GPU's own fans not need to spin up as fast, but this card for gaming, it's only drawing about 155, 158 watts, so let's take a quick listen to noise sample for your reference to what you could expect with this setup. So if you do the same build in the M2, you do get more breathing room for your GPU and a top fan as well. It's not as if the M2 doesn't offer something over this, but if you've got this case already and your GPU happens to fit in here, or the GPU you're looking at fits in here, and you're reasonable with what you want to house in it, I would be in no rush to upgrade. Still a remarkably relevant case, the volume very compact while still offering lots of room to make the build easy. You can still run a few SSDs behind the front panel, and you really do have to love the toolless panels here. It's just so satisfying to have that. And yeah, dust filters. M2 doesn't come with those, so maybe want to do that. Hope you enjoyed the build. Make sure you give a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Check out the links down below. Thanks for watching today.